Lard never hurt anybody. The thing that replaced it probably did. I have been saying that for a long time now, and I know how it sounds, but I have watched folks spend decades avoiding something their grandmothers used without a second thought, only to fill their kitchens with products that did not exist until a chemistry lab invented them. And when you look at what actually happened, how lard went from being the everyday cooking fat in nearly every American and European kitchen to something people treat like a dirty word, the story is not what you think. Most of what you have been told about lard is either wrong, incomplete, or was shaped by people who had a financial interest in getting you to buy something else. Today I want to walk you through the real history of lard, what the science actually shows about how it compares to the fats that replaced it, how to find good lard today, and how to start cooking with it if you decide it belongs back in your kitchen. By the end of this video, you will know exactly what lard is, why it fell out of favor, whether the reasons hold up under scrutiny, and what your grandma knew that somehow got lost along the way. Before I go further, if you want the full breakdown beyond what I can cover here, including a step-by-step guide to rendering your own lard at home and how to use it across different kinds of cooking, open the camera app on your phone right now and point it at the QR code in the top right corner of your screen. That will take you straight to the guide. That QR code stays pinned up there for the whole video, so you can scan it anytime as we go. No need to stop watching now. Let me start at the beginning. Lard is simply rendered pig fat. That is all it is. Pigs have fat, and when you apply gentle heat to it, that fat melts away from any tissue, clarifies, and can be poured off and stored. What you end up with is a clean, stable cooking fat with a relatively high smoke point, a long shelf life when stored properly, and a flavor that ranges from mild and neutral to pleasantly savory depending on where the fat came from on the animal and how it was rendered. The fat from around the pig's kidneys, called leaf lard, is the most prized. It is the one Grandma's generation used for pie crust. It renders into something almost flavorless and silky, and it creates a flakiness in pastry that no vegetable shortening has ever truly matched. I have made enough pie crusts over the years to say that plainly. Leaf lard makes a better crust. The fat from the back, called fatback, has a slightly more pronounced pork flavor and is wonderful for frying or sautéing. For most of human history in the Western world, lard was simply what you cooked in. Before refrigeration, before industrial food processing, before the era of the grocery store as we know it, a family that kept pigs had cooking fat. You rendered it. You stored it in a cool cellar or a covered crock, and you used it for everything. Biscuits, pie crust, fried chicken, sautéed vegetables, beans, and just about anything else that needed fat. This was not a niche tradition. This was the common practice across the United States, across Britain, across much of Europe. The shift away from lard did not happen because people discovered it was harmful. It happened because of something far less scientific than that. In the early part of the 20th century, large industrial interests figured out how to turn cottonseed oil, which had previously been considered a waste product, into a solid white fat through a process called hydrogenation. The result was vegetable shortening. Procter and Gamble introduced Crisco to American consumers in 1911, and within 3 years the company had distributed 8 million copies of a free cookbook that called exclusively for Crisco in every recipe, not one mention of lard, butter, or any traditional fat. That cookbook went into homes across the country, and it quietly repositioned an industrial byproduct as the natural choice for the modern kitchen. It was advertising disguised as culinary education, and it worked on a scale that is difficult to overstate. It was marketed aggressively as modern, scientific, and clean. Advertising campaigns of that era positioned animal fats as old-fashioned and impure, while the new hydrogenated vegetable products were presented as the healthy, forward-thinking choice. The messaging worked. Over a few decades, lard went from standard kitchen staple to something associated with a less enlightened time. And here is the part I keep coming back to. Those early vegetable shortenings were full of trans fats. Hydrogenation, the process that turns liquid vegetable oil into a solid fat, creates trans fatty acids as a byproduct. Decades of nutrition research has now linked trans fats to serious cardiovascular problems, far more convincingly than the research ever linked natural animal fats to those same problems. The FDA did not require trans fat content to appear on nutrition labels until 2006, nearly a century after Crisco first hit store shelves. By 2018, partially hydrogenated oils had been officially removed from the FDA's list of substances generally recognized as safe, which is a regulatory way of saying what researchers had been arguing for years. This stuff causes harm. One landmark analysis published in the New England Journal of Medicine estimated that eliminating artificial trans fats from the American diet could prevent between 30,000 and 100,000 deaths from coronary heart disease every single year. So the product that replaced lard on the grounds of being healthier turned out to be considerably worse. That is worth sitting with for a moment. Open the camera app on your phone and point it at that QR code in the top right corner. The guide goes into this entire chapter of food history in much more detail, including what changed in the later decades and how food labeling eventually had to catch up with what researchers were finding. Now let me talk about the fat science itself, because this is where a lot of confusion still lives. Lard is primarily composed of monounsaturated fat, the same category of fat found in olive oil, which has been praised for decades in the context of heart health. It also contains saturated fat, which is where the concern traditionally gets raised. But here is what nutrition researchers have been wrestling with for years: the relationship between dietary saturated fat and cardiovascular disease is far more complicated than the simple story we were all told beginning in the middle of the 20th century. The original research that set off the alarm about saturated fat has faced serious questions about its methodology and conclusions. Ansel Keys, whose 7-country study in the 1950s and 1960s became the cornerstone of the saturated fat hypothesis, has been criticized by later researchers for selecting data that supported his conclusion while excluding data from countries that did not fit the pattern. France, for instance, had high saturated fat consumption and low rates of heart disease, a finding that became known as the French paradox, precisely because it was so inconvenient for the prevailing theory. That does not mean saturated fat is harmless at any quantity. Moderation still matters, and if your doctor has given you specific guidance about your diet, that conversation belongs between you and your doctor, not a YouTube video. But it does mean the blanket claim that animal fats are uniquely dangerous and vegetable fats are uniquely safe was always an oversimplification, and it had real-world consequences for decades of eating habits. Natural lard, meaning lard that has not been commercially processed, contains no trans fats. It contains a modest amount of naturally occurring omega-3 fatty acids, particularly if the pig was pasture-raised. A pasture-raised pig that has access to sunlight actually produces lard with measurable levels of vitamin D. 1 tablespoon of lard from a pasture-raised animal can contain roughly 1,000 international units of vitamin D, which is a meaningful contribution for a fat that most people had written off entirely. It is a real food with a simple ingredient list: pig fat. Compare that to many commercial vegetable shortenings, which for most of their history contained partially hydrogenated oils, and even the newer reformulated versions often contain a more complex mixture of oils and additives. There is also the matter of smoke point, which matters practically when you are at the stove. Lard has a smoke point roughly in the range of what you need for frying and high-heat sautéing, comfortably higher than butter, and competitive with many of the refined vegetable oils people use for the same purpose. When fat breaks down at high heat and starts to smoke, it is releasing compounds you do not want in your food or your lungs. Lard handles heat well. That is one reason Grandma's fried chicken was what it was. And speaking of flavor, this is something I feel strongly about. A lot of what made traditional cooking taste the way it did was the fat it was cooked in. When we switched to flavorless industrial vegetable oils and refined shortenings, we lost something that was quietly irreplaceable. Beans cooked with a spoonful of lard taste different, richer, rounder, than beans cooked without it. Cornbread made with lard in a hot cast-iron skillet has a crust you simply cannot replicate with vegetable oil. Tamales, tortillas, biscuits. Traditions around the world have used lard precisely because of what it does to texture and flavor. In Mexican cooking, masa made with lard has a tenderness and richness that masa made with vegetable shortening simply does not achieve, and cooks who work in that tradition will tell you the same thing without hesitation. In Southern Appalachian kitchens, the biscuit tradition depended on lard being cut cold into flour, the same way pastry chefs talk about butter in French cooking. The flakiest pie crust I have ever made came from leaf lard. I have tried to reproduce it with other fats many times. Nothing quite gets there. So let us talk about how to actually find good lard today, because this is where a lot of folks get stuck, and I want to give you something practical. The lard on the shelf at most mainstream grocery stores for many years has been commercially processed, hydrogenated to extend shelf life, which brings back the very issue we are trying to avoid. Always read the label. What you want is lard with one ingredient, pork fat. Sometimes it will say rendered pork fat. That is the whole list. If you see partially hydrogenated anything, put it back. Better sources include your local butcher, a Latin American grocery store, where lard is sold as manteca and is often the old-style unhydrogenated kind, a farmer's market, or a farm that raises pigs directly. Brands like Epic and Fatworks now sell high-quality, unhydrogenated lard in many natural grocery chains, and both clearly list sourcing information on their packaging, which takes some of the guesswork out of it if you are shopping for a commercial product you can trust. In my experience, the best lard you can get is lard you render yourself, which I will get to in a moment. But good quality commercial unhydrogenated lard absolutely exists, and it is not as hard to find as it used to be. Health food stores and some co-ops also carry it now that there has been a quiet revival of interest in traditional fats. The full sourcing guide, where to look, what questions to ask your butcher, how to store what you bring home, is in the guide. Open your phone's camera app, point it at the QR code still up there in the top right corner, and scan it. That step-by-step information is exactly what is waiting for you. Now for rendering your own lard, which is honestly one of the more satisfying things you can do in a kitchen with minimal effort. You need fat, ask your butcher for leaf lard or fatback, and get it ground or cut into small pieces, because that speeds up the rendering. You put it in a heavy pot, add just a small splash of water to the bottom to prevent scorching while things get started, and you apply the lowest heat your stove will give you. Then you leave it alone. The fat slowly melts. The little bits of tissue that remain, called cracklings, sink or float depending on the type of fat, and eventually they turn golden and crisp. At that point, you strain the liquid fat through cheesecloth or a fine mesh strainer into a clean jar or container. What you have made is lard, real lard. The kind Grandma kept on the counter or the back of the stove in a crock with a lid. Stored in the refrigerator, it keeps for months. In the freezer, considerably longer. A half pound of rendered leaf lard will take you through a lot of pie crusts. The crackling you are left with can be salted and eaten warm. They are essentially the original pork rind, and nothing about this process is complicated. It just takes time and low heat. There is something very satisfying about making something this fundamental yourself from scratch. It connects you to the way food actually worked before everything came pre-packaged. If I were going to give you a simple plan for bringing lard back into your kitchen, here is how I would think about it. This week, read the labels on the cooking fats you already have. Know what you are working with. Then find a source for unhydrogenated lard, a butcher, a Latin grocery, a farmer's market. This month, cook one thing with it. Make a pot of beans. Fry an egg. Try a batch of biscuits. Pay attention to what the result tastes like compared to what you are used to. Let your own senses be the judge. And if you want to try rendering your own, do it on a slow Saturday morning when you have no particular reason to rush. It is a low-effort project, and the result is something to be genuinely proud of. There is no money for anyone in teaching you that the simple old thing works just fine. The whole infrastructure of modern food marketing runs on convincing you that what your grandmother did was primitive, and that the better answer is always newer, more expensive, and on a different shelf. I do not believe that. The way I see it, lard fell from grace not because of science, but because of commerce. And now the science is quietly catching up to what cooks knew all along. To go deeper on everything we talked about today, the history, the fat comparisons, how to render, how to store, and how to cook with lard across different recipes, open the camera app on your phone and point it at that QR code in the top right corner of your screen. The guide is right there waiting, and it walks through all of it at a pace where you can take notes and go at your own speed. I would love to know if your family cooked with lard when you were growing up. Did your mother or grandmother keep a crock of it on the stove? Is there a dish you remember that you have never quite been able to recreate with the fats you use now? Tell me about it in the comments. Those memories matter, and I genuinely enjoy reading them. If you found this useful, the next video on this channel is about why cast iron fell out of fashion around the same time as lard, and why the two of them belong back in your kitchen together. I think you will enjoy it. Subscribe if this kind of straightforward, no-nonsense kitchen history is what you are looking for. I am glad you are here.